Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here, and if you're watching at the time of uploading, Merry Christmas. One of my favourite festive traditions is the Christmas ghost story, so I thought today I'd scour the news archives for 3 wintry tales of eerie encounters. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's see what Santa's brought us. Number 1. The Night Visitor. The winter of 1878 was particularly harsh in Brooklyn, but inside their stately home on 136 Clinton Avenue, the Smith family had no reason to expect anything but comforts. Edward F. Smith, a builder by trade, had chosen this house for its quiet respectability. Its temple front facade and elegant columns were a sign of the growing prosperity of the borough. Yet, over 3 bitter weeks in December, that elegant, peaceful home would become a place of terror. It began innocently enough. One evening, as Smith sat with his wife and daughters in their warmly lit parlour, the front doorbell rang. He got up to answer it, expecting it to be a neighbour, but when he opened the door, he found nothing, only the empty air and untouched snow. Perplexed, he closed the door, and moments later the bell rang again. This time it seemed more insistent. Smith, still standing by the door, yanked it open immediately, and again there was nobody there. He looked around to see if anyone was hiding in the shadows, but there was no sign of anybody. These disturbances grew more bold over the following days. The doorbell was being rung multiple times a night. The back doors of the house would also shake violently, as if someone or something was trying to force their way in. Smith, assuming it was a prankster, tried everything he could think of to catch him. He would wait at the window trying to see who was there. However, the ringing continued with no sign of the culprits. Eventually he wrapped the doorbell in a cloth to muffle it. He noticed that the activity followed a pattern. The ringing and the knocking, the banging, it always began after nightfall and would cease precisely at 10 p.m. In the end, desperate for help, Smith turned to Captain McLaughlin of Brooklyn's 4th Precinct. Although they were sceptical at first, the officers of Myrtle Avenue Station responded, with Detective Price taking charge of the investigation. The house was imposing, with Corinthian pillars extending from the porch to the roof. It stood back about 40 feet from the street, protected by an iron fence. A narrow alleyway ran between their house and next door, providing access to the side doors that had been so violently shaken. Detective Price stationed officers at every entrance. One stood inside, just behind the front door, ready to catch the prankster in the act. When the bell rang, he threw the door open before the sound had even faded away, but as you can imagine, there was nobody there. The officers stationed outside claimed that they'd seen nobody approaching the door. They thought that someone might be able to hide behind the tall pillars after ringing the bell, but after careful observation, this proved impossible. There was just nowhere they could be hiding without being seen by a policeman. The alleyway at the side of the building was also watched constantly, yet the doors continued to shake and no one was ever seen doing it. Eventually the police resorted to scattering ashes and flour around the doorstep, yet even after the mysterious disturbances continued, not a single footprint appeared in the powder. Eventually, Detective Price had to admit that this case was completely beyond his understanding. He reported that while staring directly at the front door, he heard 3 distinct raps upon it, although there was no visible cause. He also says that he felt a strange sensation, like electricity running through his limbs at the exact moment when the knocks occurred. Perhaps the strangest event happened when Captain McLaughlin was sat with the members of the Smith family in a dining room. Without warning, there was a tremendous crashing sound and breaking of glass. Half a brick had somehow broken through a window, shattering 3 panes in the lower sash without damaging the frame itself. The brick had fallen to the floor inside the house, but what made this very strange was that the window was shielded on the outside by a dense grape arbor. How the brick managed to penetrate the grape arbor and then smash 3 panes of glass without damaging the frame remained completely unexplained. Word of this strange event spread quickly through the neighbourhood. Within days, hundreds of people had gathered on Clinton Avenue each evening, hoping to witness something supernatural. The crowds grew so large that the police struggled to maintain order. Inside, the Smith family were at their wits' ends, the daughters growing more and more terrified of this unseen visitor as the days passed. A boarder in the house, called R.H. Thomas, told reporters that Mr. Smith was prostrated with nervousness. He also said, "We don't know what it is, but it has no earthly agency." Then, as mysteriously as it began, the haunting stopped. Smith, who in his desperation had turned to prayer, claimed that he had been to the Lord with his afflictions and received a promise of relief. After that, there was no more knocking at the door, no more ringing of the bell, no more broken windows. The crowds dispersed, the police filed their reports, and life on Clinton Avenue slowly returned to normal. Looking into the archives, I did find something that might be of interest in this case. 8 years before the disturbances, in October 1870, a young domestic servant named Frederica Richard, or Frederica Rudolph as some accounts name her, had fallen to her death from an upper window of 136 Clinton Avenue while she was washing it. So could it possibly have been her spirit, tethered to the site of her own tragic and untimely demise? Today, 136 Clinton Avenue is known as Lefferts Laidlaw House. Visitors to the building still report strange phenomena. Most commonly, they report the sound of doors opening and closing on their own. There's also knocking sounds and the eerie sensation of constantly being watched. Number 2. The Hammersmith Ghost. In winter of 1803, in the village of Hammersmith in London, an unknown terror began stalking the shadows of Black Lion Lane. What started as whispered rumours in the local taverns soon grew into something far more sinister. The first accounts were dismissed as imagination. People had seen a tall figure draped in white glimpsed in the midnight hours, but as December wore on, the descriptions multiplied and grew more and more bizarre. Some people claimed that they'd seen a hairy creature with horns protruding from its head. Others described something that looked like a glowworm, or even a phantom that breathed fire and smoke. Some even claimed that they'd seen the creature vanishing into thin air, seeming to sink into the very earth beneath the witnesses' feet. This ghost's reign of terror continued to escalate. Women and children began avoiding the streets after dark. Even grown men would choose to take longer routes home rather than risk an encounter on Black Lion Lane. Those who did cross paths with the apparition told increasingly disturbing tales. Now it wasn't just sightings, some people were being grabbed and strangled. One victim was a wagoner who was driving 8 horses along the quiet lanes with 16 passengers on his wagon. When he encountered the ghost, he fled in terror, abandoning his horses and his 16 passengers to the spirit. One of the most tragic incidents involved a pregnant woman who was walking near the churchyard. According to her account, she watched in horror as a figure rose up from among the tombs. It was tall and shrouded in a white cloth. When she tried to flee, the ghost pursued her until she passed out from fear. Her neighbours found her and carried her home, and she did come round, but the shock had been too severe. She died just 2 days later. As increasing fear gripped the community, a number of local men started to patrol the streets at night, trying to catch the ghost in the act. One of those men was Francis Smith, a tax collector. On one bitter January night, Smith set out carrying a musket, stalking in the shadows of Black Lion Lane. Then he spotted a white figure moving silently through the darkness. Smith raised his weapon towards the figure and shouted, "Who are you? What are you? Stand still or I'll shoot." The figure didn't answer and continued moving, so Smith pulled the trigger. Unfortunately, the figure he hit was no ghost. The man in white was Thomas Millwood, a young bricklayer who had been walking home from visiting his family. Millwood's white work clothes, which were common attire for his trade, had sealed his fate. Millwood was shot in the face. The blast hit him in the jaw and neck, killing him instantly. The community was up in arms about this tragedy. At Smith's murder trial, his defence argued that the ghost panic had driven him to make a reasonable mistake. The court disagreed, declaring that no one had the right to take the law into their own hands. Smith was found guilty of murder, although later they changed their mind and he was pardoned. But the story doesn't end here. As Hammersmith mourned Millwood's death, the truth behind the haunting eventually emerged. The ghost was revealed to be a local shoemaker named John Graham. Apparently Graham's apprentice had been scaring his children with ghost stories, so Graham decided to get his own back. He donned a white sheet and began stalking in the night to scare his apprentice. What started out as a simple prank soon spiraled far beyond its scope, seeding a panic in the community that quickly got way out of hand. Ever since this original panic, Hammersmith's ghostly legacy has taken on an uncanny afterlife of its own. After Thomas Millwood was accidentally shot, his body was taken to the nearby Black Lion Inn, and some people think his spirit still haunts this pub. Its landlord has spoken of hearing strange whispering noises drifting through the empty rooms in the dead of night. Also, according to local law, the real Hammersmith ghost reappears in St. Paul's churchyard every 50 years when there's a full moon. The last notable sighting was in 1955. On this night, a large crowd gathered at the churchyard. Eventually, the police had to cordon off the area. Most people left disappointed when midnight came and there was no sign of the ghost, yet a few people decided to stay a bit later. At 1 AM, numerous people saw a figure in white drifting over the graves before melting into the darkness. Eyewitness accounts described a glowing human-like figure which was missing its legs and moving in a halting, unnatural way, although one person did say that its movement seemed a bit too jerky. They said it seemed to just be a human who was stumbling about in a white sheet that was too long for its legs. The ghost was predicted to return once again in 2005. This time only a handful of people gathered to see the ghost, and there were no conclusive sightings. Still, some people hold fast to these stories, insisting that the Hammersmith ghost still lingers on. Number 3. The Headless Cyclist. In Britain, the winter of 1940 seemed determined to break the nation's spirit. As if the war wasn't challenge enough, nature unleashed one of the harshest frosts in living memory. Deep snow blanketed the countryside, and wartime blackout restrictions meant that the nighttime streets were shrouded in darkness. Yet for George Dobbs, who had recently relocated from Stafford to Northampton, this wasn't enough to deter him from having a pint at the local Fox and Hounds pub. His route took him walking up Market Harborough Road past Kingsthorpe Cemetery. As he approached the cemetery's iron gates, he heard a car approaching. Its headlights were dimmed due to the wartime restrictions, but they still weakly lit the road ahead of him. In that light, Dobbs spotted a cyclist, unsteadily trying to keep his bicycle upright on the icy road. Something about the figure made him pause. Strangely, it looked as if the cyclist was missing his head. Dobbs assumed this must just be a trick of the lights. Perhaps it was just that his head was tightly wrapped in a dark scarf, and due to the dimness of the car's headlights, he just couldn't see the cyclist's head. The car continued up the road and came close behind the cyclist. To Dobbs's horror, the vehicle didn't slow down or make any attempt to swerve around the bike. Dobbs watched on, frozen in place, as the vehicle bore down on the wobbling bicycle. Without stopping, the car continued on down the road, past Dobbs and out of sight. He rushed on up the road to where he'd seen the cyclist, expecting to find the scene of a gruesome accident, but there was nothing there. No mangled bicycle, no injured rider, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. There wasn't even cycle tracks in the snow. Shaken, Dobbs hurried on to the Fox and Hounds, but he wasn't able to put the accident out of his mind. After one quick drink, he returned back to the cemetery gates. He began trudging back and forth in the snow in search of the injured cyclists, but still he found nothing. 2 years passed by, and there had been no report of any accidents on that road. Once more, Dobbs found himself back at the Fox and Hounds, and somehow the conversation had turned to local ghost stories. Most of the patrons laughed at such tales, but when Dobbs shared his experience, an elderly gravedigger named Lyd Green grew interested. "I know who you saw," said Green. "I buried him about 25 years ago. Deep snow that day too. He was knocked off his bike just by the cemetery gates. The crash took his head clean off." This story comes from one of my favourite books, Peter Moss's Ghosts Over Britain. I've done a bit of my own research on this case, and I haven't been able to find anything about a beheaded cyclist on that particular road. I thought I had found a story from 1929, but on closer inspection, this happened in a completely different part of the country, and it happened to someone on a motorcycle. This article claims that the Headless Cyclist could be a man named Cyril York. He died in a bicycle accident not far from the Fox and Hounds pub, although there's no report of him being beheaded, and this happened in 1934. In the story, the gravedigger claims that he was buried about 25 years before, which would put it around 1917, and although I can find some stories about traffic accidents on that road from around that time, nothing really seems to fit the bill. So is there any truth to the tale of the Headless Cyclist? It's hard to say, but it's a creepy story nonetheless. And that brings us to the end of the video. The Christmas ghost story. It's an old-time tradition that seemed to die out for a little bit, but seems to have been making a bit of a revival in the last few years. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed those stories. Merry Christmas, everybody. Huge thanks as always to the patrons. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. Have a good one, everybody. Until next time, goodbye.